Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome back to another little session today. Before we do anything, check this out. My Father's Day gift. Just, and actually, I just realised just before we're setting this up, if you open up, it's got this beautiful booklet on the inside, but it's also got the Martin Scorsese's mother's recipe for meatballs and tomato sauce. So make that tonight. So what we're going to do now is just have a little look at Melodrama. I just wanted to introduce Melodrama to you a little bit, okay? Because it's really important to us, because there's a couple of things we'll need it for. We're looking for counter-arguments all the time. And one of the arguments we're going to have to make is that, is Sunrise an example of German expressionism? And in many ways it is. But in lots of ways, it definitely isn't. That's why we've chose it, because it lends itself to argument and counter-argument, and we're always thinking about the exam and what we can get into in terms of debate and things like that. So yes, it's a German expressionist film, it's a Murnau film, its aesthetic is clearly German expressionist in many, many different places, but it's also an American film. It's also a Fox film. It's also a film from Hollywood, and therefore, and not shot or conceived of in Germany at all. And so therefore it isn't a German expressionist film as much as it is. And if it's not a German expressionist film, then what is it? And one of the arguments we can make is that it's more of an American melodrama, that it fits far more into that category than it does to German expressionism. And we've now got all of the information, all the tools at our disposal to argue that it is German expressionism. If we're making a counter-argument, we want to be able to kind of suggest that we can't just say, no, it isn't German expressionism. We need to be able to offer reasons for why. And one of the things we can point to is Melodrama, which lends academic weight to our counter-arguments. The other reasons we use in Melodrama is that Melodrama, like German expressionism, is a response to modernism. It's a modernist art form. Or a response to the wider cultural movement of modernism. And that's really interesting to us as well, because if we get to a question that asks us about broader cultural movements, is Sunrise an example of a film that was made as part of a cultural movement like modernism? Well, we can argue yes, because German expressionism is kind of born out of modernism, and Melodrama is a response to modernism in many ways as well. So we want to find where it's melodrama also. So that's part of it. And then the other thing as well is that if you get asked a question about whether this is an expressionist film as opposed to a realist film, well, we know that it's got all of these German expressionist tendencies and conventions and aesthetics. But melodrama is also an expressive genre. It isn't realism. It's extremely heightened drama. That's what it means. Melodrama, that's what it's referred to as. It's drama that's incredibly exaggerated or heightened. And so therefore we can use it to argue that Sunrise is expressionist, because it's also an example of melodrama, which is an expressionist genre itself. So there's so many ways that we can use it. So that's just what I want to introduce in this section here now. So you may have heard the term melodrama, or you may have been described as melodramatic before, and it just means heightened drama. It means it's a genre that they used to be referred to as women's pictures, which we obviously would not use now because it's outrageously sexist. But it's that idea that these were films primarily with female protagonists, where the drama was heightened to this emotional, hysterical intensity, and the drama was often domestic. Okay, so that's where the term comes from. So on your Sunrise lessons, tasks, activities PowerPoint, if you'll just we're going to look at slides 10 and 11. Okay, and just briefly talk through them. So slide 10. So let's look at what Susan Hayward talks about first of all. So she's one of the theorists, one of the film feminist writers about melodrama, okay? So she'd be great to quote, okay? Remember, you always need a quote for your essays, okay? Shows that wider reading, that wider understanding. So Susan Hayward suggests that the melodrama coincides with the rise of modernism and can be seen as a response to the Industrial Revolution and modernisation. It's a response to it. So it coincides with the wider modernist movement and the changing of everything. Not just art, remember, the entire culture is changing, including religion, including work, including the way that people lived. And melodrama is widely seen as a response to that. It looks at what's going on with modernisation, and it's worried. So it responds with a genre that kind of seems to want to return to more traditional values. It's a bit scared of modernism. That's what melodrama is, kind of. That's what Susan Hayward was saying. It's a response to it. It's kind of, whoa, 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 slow down. Let's appreciate these traditional, conventional values. And melodrama does that. So it's a response. Not all film was incredibly excited about modernism. Some film was also a little bit cautious about it too. And maybe melodrama is absolutely one of those genres, okay? Susan Hayward also argues that melodrama attempts to make sense of modernism, as we've just been saying. It's trying to make sense of what's going on, these dramatic changes to everything, okay? And it's also trying to make sense of its effect on the family unit, on the traditional family unit, because modernism is kind of like, let's move away from that, okay? Modernism was about tearing down everything that had come up until that point and be new and exciting and forward-thinking. And part of those things are the family unit as well. Does this family unit need to exist in the same way that it has done? Is there other ways of thinking about this? And that's kind of very scary to a lot of people, the idea that you would consider that you might not need the family unit in the same way. So a lot of melodrama was certainly about, by the end of the film anyway, reinforcing the belief, the very American belief in the family unit, the traditional family unit. Laura Mulvey, who we will talk about more next year as well, but we've already mentioned her in terms of Vertigo. She is one of the most influential film theorists of all time. She wrote about the male gaze. She wrote about Vertigo. She wrote about one of the most widely praised feminist film theorists, just an incredibly intelligent thinker on cinema. And she spoke about melodrama as well. And Laura Mulvey argues that the excitement of melodrama comes from, and there's the quote on slide 10, it comes from conflict not between enemies, but between people tied by blood or love. So it's not about, the gangster versus the police officer or the criminal versus the detective, or about, these kind of like these conflicts of enemies. It's about conflict between husband and wife, or conflict between people who are tied together through romance or love or family. That's melodrama. That's important for us to know. She also states, in a melodrama, for family life to survive, a compromise has to be reached. Sexual difference needs to be softened, and the male is brought to see the value of domestic life. So quite often in melodrama, they would start with the male being kind of very, very tempted by something that existed outside of the family unit, away from the wife and children, away from domesticity. So the male would kind of look towards the city, look towards the kind of the things, the exciting modernist things that were happening there, whether that was a woman or whether it was a way of life in the city, and kind of be drawn to that. And it would be the woman, the wife, the mother, who would bring him back to the family unit and make him understand the importance of it, which he would fully understand and value by the end of the film after his journey. Okay, so incredibly kind of derivatively sexist in terms of its ideologies, but these were films that were very, very popular almost 100 years ago, when the outlook on gender was very, very different to how it is now. It's really interesting to see that reflected in these films. Very traditional ways of thinking. And like we said, this is a response to modernism. This is a very conservative, conventional response to new things happening, new ways of seeing gender, new ways of seeing marriage, new ways of seeing life, and being like, no, too fast, we want to come back to this traditional way of doing it. That's what we see. And obviously, all of these things we can see in Sunrise. So have a little think now about this slide, and the next one as well, and try and link Sunrise together with them. Before we do that, let's look at slide 11, and then I'll leave you with that idea. So slide 11 here, okay? Let's look at what the conventions are, so that we understand exactly what melodrama is, okay? So, the narrative, usually sensational and exaggerated. So the heightened versions of domestic drama, or dramas that you might legitimately find in a domestic setting between husbands and wives and families, they would take them, sensationalize them. They focused on appealing to the heightened emotions of the audiences at the expense of complex characterization. So they weren't about creating three-dimensional, fully believable, realistic people. Okay, this was about heightened emotion, and so the characters were often symbolic, or they were representations. So in Sunrise we get the wife and the man and the girl from the city. These aren't meant to be real living, breathing people. They are symbols, two-dimensional kind of representations of bigger ideas. So that was popular in melodramas. There was a tendency to focus on the victim, and the victim was usually the woman. It was the woman who was betrayed. It was the woman whose husband would leave, tempted by the city, or tempted by this woman, tempted by this new way of life. So we get a focus on the victim as the protagonist, okay, who we'd want to follow, so we want to revel in those emotions, okay. Themes, common themes in a melodrama: endurance, sacrifice, bravery, okay. And if you think about all of those three things, and you think about the wife in Sunrise, then she's defined arguably by endurance, sacrifice, and bravery. They're the things that define her, okay, as a victim. So all of these things link Sunrise to melodrama as a genre, okay. The melodrama offers a triangular setup. You have the male, tempted away from the family, everything that is good. So the family and the wife and this kind of simplistic country life, its village life, is painted as good. And the temptress, who is usually a younger woman from the city, is painted as evil in some kind of way. And you've got that setup then. You've got the man in the middle being tempted by the evil temptress and return to the kind of good wife. So you've got, I mean, two incredibly sexist portrayals or representations of women. Women are either housewives and mothers who are good, or they are kind of sex-crazed temptresses from the city who are evil. And there's nothing in between for women. And you've got the man in the middle who's just this kind of, who isn't being blamed for any of this. The man is never blamed. He's never part of the problem. He's being tempted over here, or he's being drawn back over there. Like he's got no mind of his own, and it's not his fault. You know, so incredibly regressive depictions of gender, but certainly of the time. Okay, and we see this again in like a lot of the erotic thrillers of the late 80s and 90s, films like Fatal Attraction. Very much like this. You have this hapless man in the middle, who's a family man with a wife and kids, who is tempted away from that. So this genre hasn't gone away. It's absolutely still there. The two main driving forces from an ideological perspective behind melodrama are Victorian morality and modern psychology. So these filmmakers, like all filmmakers since the kind of 20s and 30s, were extremely interested in psychoanalytical explanations for human behaviour. This has been a thread that's run throughout everything that we've done, okay? It's this Freudian analysis that's there in film, because cinema is so like dreaming. It makes sense that these filmmakers would turn to Freudian psychology, which was so concerned with the interpretation of dreams and what dreams meant, okay? So they were very interested in that, but also Victorian morality, a return to traditional Victorian morality, which is about the family unit, the man as, you know, the breadwinner and patriarch, the woman as mother and housewife, the children, the family unit as sacred, okay? Very much influenced by those two things. It's a nostalgic genre, a very nostalgic. It's not about the excitement of looking forward like modernist filmmaking. It's about the nostalgia of looking backward, of what things used to be like, an idealistic version of this kind of golden time of what things used to be like. So you can see how it fits very much in with right-wing, conservative, traditional thinking. It's why we have Brexit. It's why we have the phrase, "Make America Great Again." It used to be great. It's nostalgic to look back. Do you remember that time it was great? Let's get back to there, because forward thinking is scary. So all of the things that we associate with right-wing, conservative, traditional thinking, certainly recently, like Brexit, like Trump, like all these different things, are nostalgic. And melodrama, in its kind of like regressive gender politics and its kind of desire to bring things back, to hold off from modernism and bring things back to how it was, very conservative and traditional in its thinking. Finally then, in terms of its film form, as a final little aside, we often have flashbacks associated with with Melodrama, the idea of the flashback, and that was a thing that became very popular in the 40s. Bordwell talks about this a lot, so have a look at what Bordwell says about the discovery of flashback as an editing technique. But Melodramas, and arguably Sunrise, the first to do this, revolutionary technique to be able to cut to something that had happened a long, long time ago. It was the first time that this had happened really in cinema. And then a very heightened non-diegetic score that would really manipulate and anchor your emotions. Melodrama literally translates to play with music. So it was the idea of the music really grounding you in the emotion. Okay. What I want you to do now, go to Sunrise, go through everything that we've just looked at and link it to Sunrise. Where do you see it? In the opening sequence, where do you see it? In the final sequence, where do you see it? In the sequence that you're going to choose. We're going to do our sequence analysis next lesson. Okay, so really be thinking about this before we get there. Where do you see all of these things in Sunrise? Then you're ready to go with your arguments. Cheers, guys. I'm off to make meatballs and tomato sauce. See ya.